Dr. Sutton, you wrote 3 series of books while you were a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. Can you give me basically the background of the content of these series?
Yes, the series I wrote at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University concerned the transfers of Western technology to the Soviet Union, and essentially it comprised 3 individual books. Each book covers a period of time since 1917.
And then you wrote a second series of books on Wall Street.
Yes, these were trade books. In other words, they're not academic books. They're written for the general public. They concerned the build-up of the 3 types of socialism: Bolshevik socialism in Russia, what we might call welfare socialism in the United States, and Hitlerian or National Socialism. And each book examines the financing and the contributions made by Wall Street, by international bankers, to the development of that specific form of socialism.
Now, in your research and analysis, and your efforts to bring out the facts about what was going on in our society, did you encounter any effort to discourage you, to prevent you from bringing out the background of America's involvement in the financing of international communism?
Yes, very definitely. For example, when I was at the Hoover Institution, in 1972, I went to Miami Beach to give some testimony before the Republican National Committee. And although a congressman had hand-delivered to the wire services this testimony, which was later printed, the wire services refused to transmit it to the newspapers. Then when I got back to the Hoover Institution in California, I was called into the office of the director, and I was told in no uncertain terms not to make any more speeches like that, and that this information should not be made public.
This was the information that we were giving the Soviet Union the technology to develop its war potential?
Oh yes, at that time we were in Vietnam, and as you know, the Soviets were supplying the North Vietnamese.
This was 1972?
1972, yes. And for example, I knew that the Gorky plant, which was built by the Ford Motor Company, but the Gorky plant in Russia produces the Gaz series of vehicles. The Gaz vehicles had been seen on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We were supplying equipment to the Gorky plant in the middle of the Vietnamese War, and these trucks were being used to carry ammunition supplies which were killing Americans. I thought this was morally wrong, and I said so in Miami Beach and at the Hoover Institution. And it was this type of information that was suppressed.
And so what eventually happened as far as your activities at the Hoover Institution were concerned?
Well, I didn't pay much heed to the warnings. I published a book called National Suicide in the following year, which summarized our assistance to the Soviets, our military assistance to the Soviets. And when that book came out, again, there was great pressure to stop the book. There was pressure on both the publishers and me personally. And I felt I couldn't take this, and a few years later I just left the Hoover Institution, and since 1975 I've been an independent author without any ties whatsoever.
Let's go a little bit into the background of the financing of the German war machine that we fought in the period 1941 to 1945. Could we start, first of all, with the original financing of Hitler between 1922 and 1923, when he was first making his effort to come into prominence in Germany?
The original financing of Hitler, that's in the years 1922, came only partly from Germany. One of the most prominent Americans concerned with financing Hitler was Henry Ford. In fact, Henry Ford received a medal in 1938 for his assistance to the early Nazi Party. Then, of course, Hitler had his attempted push in 1923. He went to jail, and then would begin another era in the rise of Hitler.
Right, and of course he eventually came to power in 1933 by the electoral process. What about the financing of Hitler's electoral activities in 1933?
This I can trace. I have traced it very exactly. I discovered amongst the Nuremberg records a series of bank transfer slips to the Delbruck-Schickler Bank in Berlin to an account which was under the control of Rudolf Hess. And this was the fund that was used to finance Hitler's access to power in March 1973. And amongst the corporations that transferred money to Hitler, I find not only R.G. Farben, which is quite widely known, but also German General Electric, AEG, which is under the control of General Electric in the United States, or was at that time, and companies like OSRAM and...
Now, what was the tie-in between OSRAM and General Electric?
The tie-in was a share tie-in. International General Electric in the United States had controlling interest in German General Electric, and also through share interlocks, a controlling interest in OSRAM in Germany.
So then we have Ford and we have General Electric helping to finance Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Were any other large American corporations involved?
Very definitely. Standard Oil, through its technical association with IG Farben, for example, Germany could not have gone to war in 1939 without tetraethyl. You need tetraethyl to raise the octane value of aviation gasoline. Germany had no means of doing that. This was developed in the ethyl laboratories in the United States and transferred to the Germans. Standard Oil came up with the hydrogenation idea, which was very essential for Germany in the 1930s, because to raise the quality of its gasoline for aviation purposes. This was transferred to the Nazis. And ITT, for example, International Telephone and Telegraph, was very intimately associated with the Nazis through Dr. Schroeder, who was head of the ITT subsidiaries in Germany. And ITT controlled companies which made not only electrical instruments, but also the Focke-Wulf plant, which made airplanes, fighter airplanes.
So what you're suggesting then is that American corporations were helping to finance the German industry that was building up the war potential?
American corporations, only a few, not many, financed Hitler through their subsidiaries. They transferred technology. They transferred material assistance, for example, stocks of tetraethyl before the Germans could manufacture it under the joint manufacturing agreement with the United States. And also they financed this. For example, Standard Oil financed in 1933 the development of the gasoline industry in Germany, which was needed to fight World War II.
And that's a very interesting point. Could you go a little bit into the background of where Germany got its oil to fight the Second World War? Because certainly Germany doesn't have oil resources.
Germany does not have oil resources, that's true. It used in World War II synthetic oil, which it got from coal. And the basic technical processes for the development of oil from coal came from the United States, from essentially from the Standard Oil laboratories, which had this technical assistance agreement with IG Farben. And of course IG Farben contributed something like 60% of the explosives needed by the German Wehrmacht, probably about 40-50% of the gasoline needed by the Wehrmacht and by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe.
And was there a definite interlock between IG Farben and Standard Oil?
The interlock was at the technical level the exchange of patents. It was through a financial technical assistance agreement. There were other interlocks with the United States through a subsidiary, IG Farben, in the United States. But with Standard Oil, the interlocks at the technical and financial level.
And is it a fact, it's been stated, that there were members of the board of directors of Standard Oil who were also on the board of directors of American IG Farben?
Yes, Walter Teagle is one name that comes to mind. There were several directors.
Was there an interlock with Ford between IG Farben and American IG Farben and the Ford Motor Company?
Not that I can recall, not offhand. Not offhand.
So basically what we're seeing then is American industry helping to provide the technology, helping to provide the finance, helping to provide the material that is going to allow Hitler to create his war machine.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct.
Now, in your book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, you talked about the bombing patterns during the Second World War, and the fact that it was amazing that there were certain factories that were not bombed, whereas the majority of the German factories were decimated, German-owned factories. There were certain factories that tied into this interlock we've already alluded to, that for some strange reason seemed to escape the devastation of our saturation bombing.
In World War II, the German electrical industry was or should have been a prime target for Western bombing. But in practice, the German General Electric plants were not bombed. Of the 10 major plants, not one was bombed, and a half a dozen others had trifling damage, broken windows, that kind of thing. So what we have here is a very interesting case of an industry which should have been bombed in World War II, but was not bombed, and yet we have American ownership, which raises a certain amount of suspicion as to why it was not bombed.
But as far as the German-owned electrical companies, did they undergo a rather heavy bombing?
I took a look at that. The Siemens plant, for example, they were bombed. There's no question. But the industry was not targeted as a general target. So Siemens, for example, was not bombed as heavily as, say, tank plants or aviation plants, that kind of thing.
You mentioned the Ford plant in Cologne. Was this a prime military target?
The Ford plant in Cologne should have been a prime military target. For example, the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, did bomb the Ford plant at Poissy in France. But the Ford plant in Cologne, which was by far the largest Ford plant in Germany, was not bombed in World War II.
But did our military planners intend to bomb it? In other words, was it on the aiming report?
Well, I did look at the aiming reports for the plants in Cologne. Ford was known about. They knew that it was producing equipment for the Wehrmacht. But it was not bombed. It was scheduled as a target, but it was not bombed.
So somewhere along the line, as far as the planning was concerned, the name of the Ford motor plant in Cologne was deleted, and yet the city of Cologne itself was totally decimated.
The city of Cologne was decimated, as of course many other cities in Germany were decimated. But somewhere along the line, something happened. I suspect it was in the aiming committees, and without question, orders were sent out not to bomb certain targets, even though these were prime military targets.
And that's rather reminiscent of some of the orders that went out during the Korean War, some of the orders that went out during the Vietnamese War to leave specific targets within the enemy's domain untouched by our strategic bombing.
I understand that was so, although I've not investigated it.
Now, in your book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, there was one very interesting section about a special fund that Heinrich Himmler had, and the funneling of money from German corporations into this fund, even up into the years 1943 and 1944. And many of these corporations had strong ties into the American corporations, into the American parent corporations. Could you tell us a little bit about the Kepler Fund?
The Kepler Fund was also known as the Konto S Fund. It was what we might call Heinrich Himmler's personal slush fund. He used it for his own personal projects. And what amazed me was both in 1933 and in 1944, the 2 years for which I examined the records, over half the funds came from American corporations. For example, in 1933, ITT, Standard Oil, General Electric, and possibly OSRAM were contributors. Even in 1944, in the middle of World War II, we find that ITT was funneling funds to Heinrich Himmler's fund through Schroeder, who was the chairman of the ITT subsidiaries in Germany. We also find that DEPAG, the Standard Oil subsidiary in Germany, was financing Heinrich Himmler, and this was in the middle of World War II.
Now, were these facts ever brought out at the Nuremberg hearings?
They were never brought out at the Nuremberg hearings, although the documents do exist within the files, within the records. They have not been published, as far as I know.
And you actually had access to these records?
Yes, there's some 400 tons of these records available, and many of them were at the Hoover Institution, or copies were at the Hoover Institution, and that's where I found the original documentation.
I think it's a tragic part of our history when the American public doesn't realize the interplay then between great American corporations and the financing, the funding of the Nazi movement. Now, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the Nuremberg trials, because at the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis, the Nazi war criminals, the Nazi generals were held specifically guilty for what transpired. Were there any Americans involved? Were any Americans indicted? Were any Americans